It was a chilly evening in the city, and the sound of laughter floated out from the tall glass doors of an old theater that had been turned into a venue for a charity gala. Expensive cars pulled up one after another as guests in elegant clothes stepped out, their perfumes filling the air with sweetness. Inside, chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, and music from a live band blended softly with the clinking of glasses. Everyone there seemed to know someone important. It was a night for showing off success, wealth, and beauty. Among the crowd, a woman stood quietly near the entrance, holding a small handbag close to her chest. She wore a simple gray dress and an old shawl that looked handmade. Her shoes weren't shiny, and her hair, tied back neatly, carried a few silver strands. She didn't look like she belonged there. A few people gave her curious glances, whispering softly to one another as she made her way to a corner seat. But she didn't seem bothered. She smiled politely at anyone who looked her way, then turned her eyes toward the stage where a young pianist was performing a cheerful tune. She listened closely, her eyes following every movement of the pianist's hands. For her, the music was more than entertainment. It was something sacred, something that once used to be part of her own life. Years ago, before life took its twists and turns, the piano had been her escape, her friend and her dream. But that was long ago. Now she was just another face in the crowd, unnoticed and ordinary. The evening went on. People mingled, exchanged compliments, and took photos. Waiters walked around offering drinks and small plates of food. From her seat, the woman watched it all quietly. She didn't speak much, but her eyes were kind. A few guests passed by her, assuming she might be someone's assistant or maybe part of the event staff. Some even wondered how she managed to get an invitation, but she didn't let the whispers reach her heart. At one point, she overheard a small group nearby talking about her. One of them, a woman in a shiny gold gown, leaned toward her friend and said, "Who invited her? She looks so plain." The others chuckled softly, trying not to be heard, but the sound reached her ears. She lowered her gaze and smiled faintly, pretending she hadn't noticed. She had learned long ago that silence was often stronger than any words. The host soon stepped on stage to give a speech, thanking everyone for their donations. The atmosphere became livelier again as the pianist began playing upbeat tunes, filling the hall with energy. A few guests started clapping along. Others danced near the stage. The woman continued to watch, her fingers tapping lightly on her lap, as if remembering the rhythm of the keys she once loved to play. Her eyes drifted toward the grand piano, black, shiny, and perfectly polished under the lights. It looked just like the one she used to play in her younger days, back when she performed at small community events. Seeing it brought back memories she had tucked away for years. The applause, the sound of soft notes filling quiet rooms, and the way people would close their eyes just to feel her music. But she had left that life behind. Life hadn't been kind to her, and when her world fell apart years ago, she had walked away from the piano, promising herself never to play again. The evening grew louder as people became more relaxed. Some guests gathered around the bar, laughing and teasing each other. A man in a dark suit noticed the quiet woman sitting alone and decided to make her part of their amusement. He called out loudly, "Hey, miss! You've been sitting there all night. Why don't you play something for us? You look like you've got some music in you." The people around him laughed, thinking it was a joke. The woman looked up, startled. She shook her head gently, smiling awkwardly. "Oh no," she said softly. "I'm just here to listen." But the teasing didn't stop. Another guest joined in, saying, "Come on, don't be shy. We promise we won't laugh." That made everyone laugh even more. Someone clapped their hands, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, "we have a volunteer pianist tonight." The laughter grew. Even the host looked over with curiosity. The woman's face turned a little red. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she also didn't want to embarrass anyone by refusing too strongly. Inside, she felt a mix of sadness and calm. She had seen this kind of behavior before, people judging others by how they looked, not who they were. She wasn't angry. She almost felt sorry for them. With a small sigh, she rose from her chair. The laughter quieted slightly. Some guests looked surprised that she was actually standing up. The man who had called out looked amused. "Oh, she's really going to do it," he said, grinning at his friends. Slowly, she walked toward the piano. Her footsteps were soft but steady. The chatter in the room faded little by little as people turned to watch her. The pianist who had been playing earlier politely stepped aside, not sure what to expect. She nodded to him in gratitude and sat down on the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling just slightly. For a moment, she didn't move. The hall grew quiet enough that you could hear the faint clinking of glasses from the back. People exchanged glances, waiting for her to play. Some were still smirking, expecting a few awkward notes followed by laughter. But the woman took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about the whispers or the stares. All she could hear was the silence before the music, the silence she had missed for so long. Her hands rested gently on the piano, and she stayed still for a few seconds, letting her heart catch up with her courage. She remembered her father's words from long ago. When you play, don't think about the people listening. Think about what your heart wants to say. A soft smile formed on her lips. Her fingers pressed the first key, a single pure note that echoed across the room. And just like that, everything changed. The laughter stopped. The smirks faded. Even the waiters paused mid-step. There was something in that one note, something deep, something honest. No one could explain it, but it felt as though the entire room had been pulled into her world for a moment. Her fingers began to move again, slow at first, then faster, weaving a melody that spoke without words. The plain woman they had mocked was no longer just a guest in the corner. She had become the center of the universe in that hall, and no one could look away. But that moment and that transformation, Mom, was only just beginning. The moment her fingers touched the piano, something in the air shifted. The sound was soft at first, almost shy, like a whisper breaking through a storm of noise and laughter. Then it grew warmer, stronger, more alive. The room, filled just minutes ago with careless chatter, became completely silent. Every person there turned their head toward her, their eyes following her hands as they glided across the keys. The melody that came out wasn't fancy or showy. It wasn't the kind of song meant to impress. It was pure, honest, and full of feeling. Each note carried something human, something deep and familiar. It spoke of love, pain, loss, and hope all at once. Those who had laughed earlier now found themselves unable to move. It was as if the music had frozen them in place. Her body moved with the rhythm in a natural way, as though the piano had been waiting for her all night. The sound filled the hall, wrapping around the guests like a gentle wind. The man who had mocked her before tried to smile, but even he felt his throat tighten. There was something in the melody that stirred memories, of things long forgotten, of quiet moments, of people they once loved. The woman's eyes were closed as she played. It wasn't about showing skill or gaining attention. She was somewhere else, in a world where music and emotion were the same thing. Her fingers moved with ease, but every movement carried meaning. The audience could feel that she wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. Her story. The song grew softer for a while, almost like a whisper between two people who understand each other without words. Then slowly it began to rise again, stronger and more powerful. It felt like the sound of someone remembering who they really are after years of silence. Some guests found themselves holding their breath without realizing it. One woman pressed her hand to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. She didn't know why she was crying, but the music had touched something hidden inside her. Even the waiters stopped serving and stood still, their trays frozen in their hands. The pianist who had played earlier watched in awe. He had never seen anyone play with such emotion. The woman wasn't trying to be perfect, and that was exactly why it was perfect. Every imperfection made it real, and every pause made it human. After a few minutes, the melody took a new turn. It changed from sadness to something brighter, more hopeful. It was as if she was reminding herself and everyone listening that beauty can grow even from pain. The rhythm became steadier, lifting the mood little by little. Some guests began smiling through their tears. They could feel that something beautiful was happening right before their eyes, something that didn't need to be explained. The music spoke louder than any words could. It told a story of struggle, of dreams lost and found again. And even though no one knew her name or her past, every single person in that hall felt like they knew her heart. It was as if the piano had given them a window into her soul. When the final note came, it lingered in the air, soft and long, fading slowly into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. The woman's hand stayed on the keys, resting gently, her shoulders rising and falling as she breathed. Then she opened her eyes, and the room, still caught in the spell of her music, remained completely still. And then, it happened. The entire hall erupted into applause. People stood up from their seats, clapping and cheering with tears in their eyes. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others simply covered their mouths, unable to speak. The sound of hands clapping echoed off the walls like thunder. The woman blinked, almost surprised. She hadn't played for praise. She had just wanted to release something she'd kept hidden for years. But the reaction overwhelmed her. A few guests rushed forward, eager to know who she was. The man who had mocked her earlier tried to apologize, but he couldn't find the right words. His proud smile was gone, replaced by shame. One of the event organizers stepped forward and asked softly, "Who are you?" That was extraordinary. She hesitated for a moment before answering in her calm, humble voice. "Just someone who used to love music." That simple answer only made the audience love her more. They wanted to know everything: where she had learned to play, why she had stopped, how someone so quiet could hold such power in her hands. But she didn't say much. She just smiled and thanked them for listening. The host invited her to take a bow, and though she looked a little embarrassed, she stood and gave a small nod. The applause grew even louder. The pianist who had played earlier stepped forward too, clapping with genuine admiration. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he said quietly. She thanked him, but her eyes were already drifting back toward the piano, as if she wasn't ready to say goodbye to it yet. When the applause finally faded, the guests began to talk again, but this time their voices were softer, more thoughtful. They spoke not about dresses or money or status, but about the way the music made them feel. Someone said it reminded them of their grandmother, who used to hum the same kind of melody. Another said it made them think of their childhood home. Everyone had felt something personal. The woman quietly returned to her seat as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everywhere she went, people looked at her differently now. The same ones who had laughed earlier were now whispering with admiration. They couldn't believe how wrong they had been. A few guests came over to thank her in person. One of them said, "You reminded us what real beauty sounds like." She smiled, a little shy, and said softly, "I'm glad you listened." The rest of the evening carried on, but it wasn't the same anymore. The air felt calmer, gentler, as if the music had changed the entire energy of the room. Even the lights seemed warmer. People laughed less loudly and spoke with more kindness. The music had humbled everyone in a quiet way. From her seat, the woman looked at the piano once more. It had been so long since she had touched one, yet her fingers had remembered everything. Every key, every note, every emotion. She realized then that music never really leaves you. It stays somewhere deep inside, waiting for the right moment to return. As the night ended and the guests began to leave, a few of them stopped to say goodbye to her. They wished her well and thanked her again. Some even asked if she would perform again someday. She smiled politely and said, "Maybe, when the time feels right." When she finally stepped outside, the cold night air greeted her. The city light shimmered on the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance she could hear faint music playing from another place. She took a deep breath and walked slowly down the quiet street, feeling lighter than she had in years. Behind her, inside that grand hall, people were still talking about her performance. None of them would ever forget that night. The night when a woman they once ignored showed them what true beauty and grace really looked like. And though she disappeared into the darkness of the city, her music stayed behind, echoing in every heart that had listened, reminding them that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people carry the most extraordinary stories within them. When she left the hall that night, the world outside felt different. The air was cold, but she felt a quiet warmth inside her chest. For the first time in years, she felt alive, like something that had been sleeping deep inside her had finally woken up. The sound of her own music still echoed in her mind, and she smiled to herself as she walked down the empty street. She hadn't expected any of that to happen. When she first sat down at the piano, she only wanted to stop the laughter, to make them see that mocking someone could hurt. But when her fingers touched the keys, all of that disappeared. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her memories, her pain, her love for music, and the part of herself she had buried for so long. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she stopped by a small park not far from the theater. The benches were empty. and the streetlights gave the place a soft golden glow. She sat down and looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind the city lights, but she could still see a few twinkling quietly. For a moment, she just sat there, breathing slowly, thinking about everything that had happened. She remembered how everyone's faces had changed when the music began. The shock, the silence, the tears. It wasn't pride she felt. It was peace. For years, she had believed that her music no longer mattered, that her talent had faded with time. But that night proved her wrong. The music was still there, waiting patiently for her to return. As she sat quietly, she thought back to the time when music had been her whole life. She had once played in small theaters and community halls, not for fame, but because she loved the feeling of touching people's hearts through sound. But life had changed quickly. When her family fell into hardship, she had to give up her dream and take other work just to survive. The piano became something she looked at from a distance, something she missed but couldn't afford to touch again. Over time, she convinced herself it was all in the past. Yet here she was, years later, and the piano had found her again. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight came through the thin curtains, lighting up the small apartment where she lived alone. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, thinking about the people she had met at the gala. She wasn't used to attention, but last night had changed that. Her phone buzzed several times, messages from people who had been at the event. Some were from guests she didn't even know, thanking her for her performance, saying her music had touched them deeply. One message stood out. It was from the event organizer. They wrote that the moment she played the piano had become the highlight of the evening, and everyone was still talking about it. They wanted to know if she would consider performing again, maybe at another charity event or even a small concert. She stared at the message for a long moment. Part of her felt nervous. It had been years since she had performed in front of anyone, but another part of her, the one that had come alive at the piano, whispered that maybe this was a sign. Maybe life was giving her another chance. That afternoon, she decided to visit a music store she used to go to many years ago. It was a small place tucked between two tall buildings, with a sign that had faded from years of rain and sun. When she walked in, the smell of old wood and sheet music filled the air. The owner, an older man with gentle eyes, recognized her instantly. "I knew it," he said softly, smiling. "When I saw that video online, I thought, that has to be her." She looked surprised. "You saw it?" He nodded. "Everyone's seen it. Someone at the gala recorded your performance. It's everywhere now. People are calling you the mystery pianist." Her heart skipped a beat. "Everywhere?" He chuckled kindly. "Don't worry. It's not a bad thing. The world needs to hear music like that again. Real music from the heart." She walked through the store slowly, running her fingers over the edges of old pianos, the ones that hadn't been tuned in years. The keys felt familiar under her hand. For a moment she closed her eyes, imagining herself playing again, not for crowds, but for the joy of it. The shop owner said gently, "You should come here whenever you want. Play, practice, or just sit. Music doesn't belong to the past. It's still yours." His words stayed with her. Over the next few days, she returned often. At first she played softly, shyly, afraid her fingers had lost their strength. But soon the music began to flow again. The more she played, the more she remembered. The way sound could fill an empty space. The way emotion could pour out through each note. Sometimes the shop owner would stand quietly by the door, listening with his eyes closed, smiling to himself. One evening, a small crowd gathered outside the shop window as she played. Passers-by stopped to listen, drawn by the sound. A few even recorded her on their phones, but she didn't notice them. She was lost in her world again, the same way she had been that night at the gala. After she finished playing, a little girl came into the shop, holding her mother's hand. She looked shy but curious. "Miss," the girl said softly, "your music made me feel happy and sad at the same time." "How do you do that?" The woman smiled, touched by the child's honesty. "Maybe because when I play I don't think about being happy or sad," she said. "I just play what my heart feels, and sometimes the heart feels both." The little girl nodded as if she understood completely. That small moment meant more to her than all the applause she had received at the gala. She realized then that sharing her gift again wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection. Later that week, She got another message from the organizer, inviting her to perform at a community center for children who couldn't afford music lessons. This time she didn't hesitate. She said yes. When the day came, she walked onto the small stage of the community center, her heart calm but full. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide with excitement. She told them a little about music, how it doesn't have to be perfect, how it can heal even the deepest hurts. Then she began to play, the room filled with sound, gentle, warm, and full of life. The children listened quietly, completely focused, their faces glowing. Some closed their eyes. Others swayed to the rhythm. When she finished, they clapped and cheered, running up to thank her. In their joy, she saw herself as a little girl again, the girl who had once dreamed of touching hearts through music. That night, as she walked home, she felt light and free. The world that had once felt too heavy now felt open and full of possibility. Her music had found its way back into her life, and she knew it was there to stay. What began as a night of mockery had turned into something far greater, a second chance, a quiet reminder that even when life pushes someone into silence, the song inside them never truly dies. It waits for the right moment, the right place, and the courage to begin again. The weeks that followed changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. After the gala and her quiet visits to the music shop, more invitations began to arrive. Small events, community gatherings, even a local radio show asked her to perform. She didn't say yes to all of them. She was careful, choosing only the ones that felt meaningful. Each time she sat at a piano, she reminded herself it wasn't about attention or fame. It was about sharing something that had always been hers, something that could reach people in ways words never could. One afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation to perform at a private event. The venue was a large mansion owned by a wealthy family who had heard of her gala performance. They wanted her to play for a gathering of their friends and associates, influential people who were used to luxury, applause, and carefully curated entertainment. When she read the message, she hesitated. She remembered the night at the gala, how some of the same kind of people had mocked her. Her fingers itched to play, but her heart felt cautious. After thinking about it, she decided to go. She told herself that she wasn't doing it for them. She was doing it for herself and for the music, and if they learned anything along the way, that would be their gain. When she arrived, the mansion was grand beyond imagination. The floors gleamed, crystal chandeliers sparkled, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume. Guests in designer clothes were already mingling, laughing and sipping champagne. The family welcomed her politely, showing her to the grand piano in the center of the room. It was polished black, each key reflecting the light perfectly. She felt the familiar mix of nerves and excitement as she sat on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, and she took a deep breath. Then she played. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but the moment the melody began to flow, the room changed. The laughter, the chatter, the casual conversation, it all stopped. Eyes turned to her as if the music had pulled everyone into a single space, a quiet world that existed only while she played. The melody grew richer, more complex, and deeply emotional. She didn't think about the audience. She let the music move her, and her hands followed naturally. Each chord, each note carried a story, her story unspoken but understood. The wealthy guests, used to control and status, felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Some pressed their hands to their chests. Others closed their eyes, unable to look away, afraid that if they did, they might miss the magic of the moment. One man, the same one who had subtly mocked her at the beginning of the evening, could not hide his astonishment. His smile disappeared, replaced by a look of awe. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch every nuance, every emotion she poured into the music. He had come expecting a simple performance, maybe even a bit of awkwardness for entertainment. Instead, he found himself humbled by the talent of someone he had never taken seriously. The melody swelled and softened in turns, moving like waves across the room. Some guests leaned against the walls, holding their breath. Others whispered softly to each other, barely daring to speak above the music. It was impossible to ignore her presence, impossible to dismiss what she had to give. She wasn't just playing notes. She was speaking with her soul. By the time the final chords echoed and faded, the room was utterly silent. No one moved for a few moments, unsure of how to respond. The spell she had cast with her music lingered, leaving a quiet awe that filled every corner of the grand hall. Then slowly one person began to clap. Another joined in. And then the entire room erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite applause. It was deep, heartfelt, and full of respect. People stood, cheering and clapping, some even whistling in amazement. A few of the wealthy guests who had arrived with a sense of superiority found themselves humbled in a way they hadn't expected. They whispered to each other, clearly shaken by the realization that they had underestimated her. She stood quietly, accepting the admiration with a small, humble smile. She didn't bask in it. She let the moment exist naturally. Her music had done its work. It had spoken louder than words, and she felt the satisfaction of that truth. Afterwards, a few guests approached her, their faces sincere, their voices soft. They asked about her background, where she had learned to play, and how she had become so skilled. She told them only a little, keeping the focus on the music itself rather than herself. She wanted them to understand that talent and beauty were not always obvious on the surface, that sometimes the quietest person carried the loudest story inside. One woman, a guest who had previously laughed at her at a different event, confessed with tears in her eyes, "I judged you wrong. I'm sorry, you're extraordinary." The woman smiled gently. "Thank you," she said, "but there's no need for apologies. Music teaches us all in its own way." That night, as she left the mansion, she felt a quiet confidence she had never known before. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She had learned that her music could break through barriers, the laughter, the judgment, the arrogance of others, and leave only truth behind. And she realized that her power wasn't in fame or recognition. It was in the honesty of her expression. Over the following weeks, invitations continued to arrive. People wanted to hear her play at private events, small theaters, and even local schools. She had become, without seeking it, a source of inspiration, and yet she remained grounded, careful to choose engagements that felt right. She never played for praise alone, never performed for those who didn't respect her or the music. One afternoon, she received a letter from a music school in the city. They had heard about her performance at the mansion and wanted her to teach a few master classes for young students. At first, she hesitated. Teaching had never been her primary goal. But then she thought about the children, about the young ones who might one day feel like they had no place in the world of music. She realized that she could help them, that she could guide them in ways that only someone who had been silent for years could. She accepted the invitation. Her first class was small, only a handful of students, but they were eager, curious, and full of energy. As she began teaching, she discovered that her years away from performing had not dulled her understanding of music. If anything, her experiences had deepened it. She could speak to the students not just about technique, but about feeling, about emotion, about honesty. She taught them that music wasn't just notes on a page. It was life itself. After the class, one student stayed behind. He looked nervous but hopeful. "I never thought I could play like that," he said softly. "I didn't think I had it in me." She knelt beside him, smiling warmly. "Music isn't about being perfect," she said. "It's about being true to yourself. Everyone has their own song inside. You just have to find it." That night, as she walked home, she reflected on how far she had come. The mocking laughter at the gala seemed like a distant memory now. What had begun as humiliation had become a journey of rediscovery, of courage, and of connection. She understood now that her life had a rhythm, just like the music she played, and that every note, every experience, every challenge had led her to this moment. She had learned that music, like life, could heal, inspire, and transform. And in that understanding, she found a quiet joy that no applause could match. The months that followed felt like a dream, though she knew it was real. Her music had found its way into places she never imagined. She played at schools, small theaters, local events, and even quiet charity gatherings, always letting the music speak first and herself second. Every time her fingers touched the keys, she felt alive in a way she hadn't felt for years. The joy she had buried deep inside had returned, stronger and brighter than ever. She had become a quiet inspiration to many, though she never sought the spotlight. People spoke of her performances in hushed, awed tones. Videos of her playing continued to circulate online, shared by strangers who had been touched by her music. Messages poured in, some from children saying her music made them feel brave, some from adults saying it reminded them of moments they had thought were long lost. Each note she played seemed to reach further than she could see, changing lives quietly, one listener at a time. Yet, she remained humble. She never let the attention change her. She still wore simple clothes, still smiled softly, and still preferred the quiet corners of the world when she wasn't playing. The fame that could have overwhelmed someone else only made her more careful, more thoughtful. She had learned that music wasn't about recognition. It was about connection, about reaching hearts in ways that words often failed to. One evening, she received an invitation that made her pause. It was from a large city concert hall, one she had once dreamed of playing in when she was younger. The hall was known for its grand stages, its bright lights, and audiences who expected perfection in every note. Reading the letter, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was different from her usual performances. It wasn't small or private. Hundreds of people would be watching, many expecting a polished, famous pianist. She hesitated at first. Memories of past disappointments, of times when she had walked away from music, crept in. But then she remembered the first night at the gala, the moment when she had played not for approval but simply because it was in her heart. That night had changed everything. If she could remember that feeling, that freedom, she could face any stage. The night of the concert, she arrived early. The hall was magnificent, with rows of seats stretching far back, chandeliers hanging like stars above, and the stage bathed in soft light. People were already taking their seats, chatting quietly, unaware that someone ordinary was about to leave them speechless. She felt the familiar calm as she approached the grand piano. Sitting on the bench, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When her fingers touched the keys, the sound flowed immediately. Naturally, the first notes filled the hall, soft and gentle, wrapping around the audience like a warm embrace. The people who had come expecting a performance, perhaps even a show, were silenced. There was something in her music that was deeper than technique or skill. It was life, emotion, and truth all at once. She played for what felt like hours, though it was only moments. The audience was entranced, leaning forward in their seats, holding their breath, closing their eyes. They didn't just hear her music. They felt it. They felt the years she had lived quietly, the pain she had endured, the hope she had carried in her heart. Each note was a story, each chord a memory. Toward the middle of her performance, the music grew more intense. It was powerful, but never loud for the sake of volume. It rose and fell like waves, full of emotion and depth. Some in the audience wiped tears from their eyes, others sat frozen, mesmerized. No one moved or spoke. The room was suspended in time, completely absorbed in the story she told without words. When she finally reached the final chord, she let it linger. The sound faded slowly, echoing off the walls, leaving a silence so profound that it felt like the air itself was listening. Then, as if the spell had finally broken, the audience erupted. Hands clapped, feet stomped, and cheers filled the hall. It wasn't just polite applause. It was admiration, awe, and gratitude all at once. People were on their feet, some crying, some laughing with disbelief at the emotion they had just experienced. She stood slowly, feeling a gentle warmth in her chest. She wasn't used to so much attention, yet it didn't frighten her. She gave a humble nod, letting the music speak for her one last time. She didn't need to say anything. The audience already understood. They had witnessed not just talent, but the story of a life lived quietly, a talent that had been hidden for years, and the courage it took to let it shine again. After the concert, as she stepped off the stage, people approached her one by one. Some spoke softly, some choked on their words. Many said they had judged her at first glance, expecting nothing, and now they were ashamed. They told her she had changed their perspective, reminded them that appearances can deceive and that true talent and beauty often hide in the most unexpected places. She smiled gently, saying little, letting her music and her calm presence do the talking. A young girl came forward holding a small notebook. She had written a message for the pianist. "Thank you for showing me that I can do something I love, even if I'm quiet and shy. Your music gave me courage." The woman's eyes softened. She knelt to speak to her. "Always believe in your own song," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter if anyone sees it at first. The music inside you is important no matter what." Walking home that night, the streets felt alive with possibility. She passed familiar corners, the smell of baked bread from a nearby shop, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Every step felt lighter, freer. She had come full circle, from the mocking laughter at the gala to the recognition of hundreds, and most importantly, to her own acceptance of herself, she understood something essential now. Life would always have its critics, its laughter, its doubts, but the courage to rise above them, to trust in one's own talent and heart, was a kind of quiet triumph that no one could take away. Music had given her that courage, but she had also discovered that she carried it within herself all along. The next morning, she returned to the music shop where she had started playing again after the gala. The owner greeted her with a knowing smile. "I saw the video from last night," he said. "The world is starting to notice." She smiled but shook her head. "I didn't do it for them," she said softly. "I did it because it was time to play again." He nodded. "And in doing so, you reminded everyone else that true beauty and talent can't stay hidden forever." Over the following months, she continued to play for those who wanted to listen, for students who wanted guidance, and for small gatherings where music was more than entertainment, it was connection. She never sought fame, but it found her nonetheless because the truth of her music was undeniable. People began to understand that what she had to offer wasn't just skill, but honesty, emotion, and courage. One quiet evening, she sat alone at her piano in the little room where she practiced, the keys worn but familiar under her fingers. She closed her eyes and played softly, just for herself. No audience, no applause, no pressure. The notes floated gently, filling the room with peace. And in that moment she felt complete. She had found her place in the world again, not because anyone had forced her to be noticed, but because she had chosen to honor her own voice, her own heart. She realized that life had a rhythm of its own, a series of notes, some soft, some harsh, some joyful, some sad. And when she had finally trusted herself to play her own song, the world had listened. The mocking laughter, the doubt, the silence of years, and it all led her here, to a life filled with music, courage, and quiet joy. Her story became one of hope for anyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. It was proof that talent and truth could not stay hidden forever, and that sometimes the smallest, quietest people carry the most extraordinary gifts. And as she played, night after night, teaching, performing, and sharing her music, she knew one simple truth. The music inside her had always belonged to her, and by embracing it, she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others as well. The piano, the music, and her courage had created a ripple that would continue far beyond her own story. She had been forced to play once, mocked and underestimated, but now she was free to share, free to inspire, and free to live fully, one note at a time. And in that freedom she found the greatest triumph of all,